Dignitaries, ministers, officials, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Thank you. Please, if you could take your seats, because we are now going to convene the second part of our first high-level session, the theme of which is activating the mechanisms of the humanitarian development nexus. Activating the mechanisms of the humanitarian development nexus. So if all of you could please take your seats, because we are about to begin, and I will call those taking part in this discussion to the stage. Remember, they have some really important things to say which they would like to share with you. So if you could all be seated so that we can really listen to what they have to say and take away the lessons that I'm sure we can learn whilst we're all together. So, as we convene, can I ask you please to welcome to the stage Henrietta Fore. Henrietta Fore is of the United Nations Children's Fund. In fact, she is the executive director of an organisation that many of us know as UNICEF. So thank you so much for joining us. Can you also welcome Filippo Grandi, who is High Commissioner, United Nations High Commission for Refugees. Filippo Grandi, thank you so much. Thank you. Now, Antonio Vitorino is the Director General of the International Organization for Migration. Now, he is currently in a meeting, but I am assured that he will join us in a few moments' time. But Antonio Vitorino will be joining us on the stage when that meeting is concluded. Could you also please give a very warm welcome to Dr. Khaled bin Suleiman Al-Quderi, who is the Vice Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Saudi Fund for Development. And could you also welcome our final panellist, Jan Egeland, Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. And can you give a very warm welcome to Hadley Gamble. She's the journalist and anchor at CNBC Abu Dhabi, who will be moderating this panel.
Good afternoon, everybody, once again, and welcome back. Distinguished panelists, thank you all so much for joining us. I want to kick off by asking you to walk us through some of your experiences in terms of implementing the collaborative efforts that we've been talking about throughout the morning. I'd love to kick off actually with Henrietta, if we could, and walk us through how you see the challenges of today, given the global dynamic. We've got COVID-19, but also when you think of this within this context of humanitarian aid and the donor fatigue that we've been talking about this morning, how is that impacting you?
So thank you very much, and it is a great pleasure to be here at the conference. The questions you ask are the ones that we always struggle with because the needs are so much larger than the number of resources that we have in the world. And it is very difficult, therefore, to find a way to decide where to place your investment. How do you invest for a peaceful, prosperous world? So at UNICEF, we do both humanitarian and development assistance, and we are about half humanitarian assistance and half development assistance. The humanitarian portfolio has grown exponentially in recent years, and it has the greatest demands because of the number of crises. But the development portfolio often gets overlooked because it is longer term. Therefore, we have just in the last 2 years really emphasized this humanitarian to development continuum so that in every humanitarian situation we try to plant the seeds of development. And because we work in the world of children and young people, it's very important for water systems and very important for school systems, education systems, to work on the first day of a humanitarian crisis, but also they have to be there 5 years later, so in the time of development. So how you link these programs, how you sew them together is extremely important. And the same is true with the COVID crisis. It is a health emergency, but it is one that is that can be addressed in every country. So communications to the populace, making sure that communities know how to look after themselves. We find it with Ebola too. We find it with many of the health challenges. We also find that there are some very small things that private companies can do to help us. So for instance, when we have floods or earthquakes or we have natural disasters, one of the things that happens is that the roofs are often blown off of schools. We saw it in Mozambique when the hurricanes came through. So a little fastener that can keep roofs onto homes and onto schools is something that is extremely important. And it allows it not to just be responding to a humanitarian emergency, but rather that it becomes development. Similarly, a cash program can be one that can take you from humanitarian to development. And then young people, they are really, really excited about these peace-building efforts, so they too can be bridges between humanitarian and development work. So world over, we find that there are ways that we can do this as a world. It takes planning, it takes funding, and it takes commitment from all of us, but we can do it.
In terms of that messaging, especially when you talk about the development aspect of this and the longer term implications that creates for governments and non-governmental organizations that are funding your programs, at the end of the day, you have to be able to show them some kind of results. How do you communicate to them the need here? Because a large part of this is mental health, isn't it? Especially when you're talking about children.
Yes, so this year there are two areas that have really come to the world's attention. One is climate change and one is mental health. And both have to be woven into all of our programs. And to your very good point, governments need to know that this is part of how we sort of stabilize our societies and how they are able to have resilience. Because young people, when we do surveys, 1 out of 3 will often have some sort of a mental health challenge or problem. And they want to talk about it. They're a very different generation than our generation. We didn't talk about it. You never told somebody at work, your boss, that you had a mental health problem. But this group, this generation, they tell their teachers and their friends, and they want help. So we need to be where they are, and we need to, as governments and as UN agencies and as nonprofit organizations and corporations, to really make sure that we're looking after mental health of our young.
This question then to the executive director of, to the Director General for Migration, who's just joined us on the end there. Welcome, sir. Antonio, when you think about this a bit more broadly, you're talking about the movement of people globally. We've seen the results of the migration patterns into Europe, how that has politicized things to such a degree that even I think no one was quite prepared for that. When you think about that with regards to the backlash in those countries and the fact that you're even seeing, for example, Turkey trying to force the hand of Germany and other European countries at this point with regards to migration and refugees, taking a step back, how dangerous is it that we will continue to see lost generations? And what are you doing as part of the International Organization for Migration to attempt to get a handle on that situation? Because no matter where they're living in the world, it's a problem for all of us.
Well, thank you so much, and I'm sorry for coming late. I think that we live in societies that are each time more and more polarized from the political point of view. It's not just migration, it's in general terms, but of course migration is a policy area where passions are very much heated and opposition in internal politics of the member states is more evident. We try to make the case that there is a need to look to the positive sides of migration. If migration is regular, orderly, is safe, migrants can have a positive impact in the development of host countries and also of countries of origin. But in countries of origin, we are confronted with new realities. I don't know if Philip has already mentioned this, but we deal quite a lot with IDPs, for instance, internally displaced people, who are in a huge number, who live out of humanitarian assistance, and you need to show to those people that there is life beyond humanitarian assistance. There is hope. And that's where you make the link between the situation of protracted displaced people with the need of development tools, but to create livelihood for the future. But at the same time, you can never forget that quite a large number of people that are displaced, they run away from conflicts, from insecurity, from climate change. And if you do not address these deep root causes, you cannot build the trust necessary for the people to believe that there is really life after humanitarian assistance. And that's the challenge I think the UN agencies and the NGOs and the civil societies are confronted with today.
Filippo, when you think about this more broadly in terms of activating these mechanisms, showing the global community, those donor nations, non-governmental organizations, where this can work and how this can work. What are some examples of where you've seen the ability of humanitarian organizations to work together to create this kind of narrative?
I think that back to the theme of this session, first of all, we have to say two things that may appear obvious. First, that the complexity of these crises that we're talking about is increasingly recognized. We spent decades treating them as humanitarian crises and responding with humanitarian means that are perfectly useful and important, but short-term and not conducive to sustained responses. So there is now a recognition that it is much more complicated and it requires a much more complex response. It's not easy to explain this to the general public, but I think that it is important to recognize that we're moving in that direction. I would even say, and that's my second point, this humanitarian development nexus, as it is often called, I don't know if it's the right name, is already happening in many places. We, in the sphere in which we work, I work, refugees, this became very apparent in 2015. You mentioned the arrival of a large number of people in Europe, a complicated crisis, refugees, migrants, a political impact. This had a lot of negative consequences that you hinted at, but it had at least the benefit to be an eye-opener. And following that, a series of initiatives led to the creation of instruments that allow now development actors to intervene, as Henrietta says, at the beginning of a crisis. I want to give you, to conclude, just one example. I was recently in Burkina Faso, and I don't exaggerate if I say that, I've worked more than 30 years in humanitarian aid. This is one of the worst, I think Jan was there as well, one of the worst crises I have seen in terms of number of people impacted, number of people killed, children separated from families, women raped and subjected to violence. So eminently a humanitarian crisis that needs an immediate, very urgent response, but that is built on a deficit in development, a gap in development. There is already a very high rate of children that don't go to school prior to the crisis. Now these armed groups, these terrorists, destroy schools, so they compound an education crisis. So the response has to be short-term. We need to build schools, rebuild schools, give resources for the education system to restart, but we need to look back at why there is an education deficit. This is a developmental operation. So we need to work together. And my very, very last point, the challenge here, going back to your question, if I may be, with all due respect for development organization, the challenge is for them to become more like us, more like humanitarian organizations, respond quickly, show the dividends of their action, of international cooperation, to the ordinary people, to governments that are in charge of these fragile countries. We need to accelerate the developmental impact. We cannot wait anymore. There's no more the luxury of waiting 5 years, 10 years to see the first results. We, on the humanitarian side, need to become better, more experienced, more adept at attracting developmental resources, and therefore to work together. We have started. Now the question is not whether we do it, but how we do it and how we improve it.
Jan, you want to add to that, just in terms of that narrative, in terms of implementing at the same time, not just development, but humanitarian?
Filippo is absolutely right on this. And yes, I was just 3 weeks back in Burkina Faso, which is the place on earth with the most rapidly growing displacement crisis in the world. And nobody talks about it because everybody's talking about 2 or 3 countries and the coronavirus, which is killing very few. In Burkina Faso, a lot of people are killed and a lot of people are displaced. Now, what's the problem then for us as non-governmental organizations who are massively in the field? It's really the national non-governmental organizations, the civil society organizations, and the international non-governmental organizations who are often deploying most people to the deep field. Well, in northern Burkina Faso, we're not getting money at the moment. There is a lot of places where one has been discussing now the nexus for 3 years. And if I have understood it correctly, it would mean that the $6 to $8 billion pledge for development for the Sahel should be able to translate to emergency education, which is really a development organization, for example, in northern Burkina Faso. We're not getting money. So it's not another seminar in Geneva that is needed for northern Burkina Faso. It is that those who have pledged development money, who will not spend it, not going to be spent in places where there are 5 terrorist organizations and where people are fleeing for their lives and there are bombs going off all the time. That money pledged for them will not be spent this year. So that money needs to be converted, and then I agree again with Filippo. So the development, the international financial institutions especially, have to get into a modus where they can pledge funding for emergencies, for conflicts, and for disaster areas that is helping us real time, and we pledge to be accountable and to work on durable solutions for the people there. That's nexus for me, and it's happening too little in Barcelona, Burkina Faso at the moment. It's a little bit more in New York and Geneva.
How much is the politics there limiting what you're able to do? How much does the politics of that, in terms of the financial institutions, in terms of the financial instruments? Because the folks that I speak to on a regular basis say to me, you know, what's holding us back is the fact that various administrations in the United States or elsewhere are afraid of funding terrorists.
But one of the politics coming in is all of these absolutely draconian anti-terrorism laws, sanctions, etc., which makes it even impossible for us to do humanitarian negotiations for access with armed opposition groups, which is the whole point of humanitarian work, is that we speak to anyone, we speak to the devil, if necessary, to help the victims at the depths of hell. That's humanitarian work. And now there's laws prohibiting that from many donor countries and from many of the countries in which we operate. But the slowness in going from declarations about nexus to money to Barcelona, where I was, where there is no money now, and where there are 100,000 children without school, that is more, you know, all sorts of requirements of, it's really risk aversion. Everybody talks about the taxpayers' money and we cannot risk it, etc. I'm a taxpayer myself, actually. I'd like my taxpayer money to reach the people in greatest need at the time when they need it. We need to be a little bit more flexible. That's my point.
Dr. Al-Qaderi, could you weigh in on this as well, in terms of your experiences? How do you get around such a significant blocker?
Well, thank you, and let me at the outset thank King Salman Center for hosting this important conference, which I believe the subject of the conference is very important, and it has to be discussed and put some tangible steps. Back to your point. I think the first session of this conference, I mean, they have shed some light on the humanitarian development nexus and the definition of themselves. I don't want to go through the definitions and how to distinguish the humanitarian from development, but I think it's well known to everybody. But we are a development institution, actually, but we do some part of humanitarian when it's needed. You cannot do a development without humanitarian process, and you cannot do humanitarian without putting in your mind the development aspect as well for sustainability. So I guess what colleagues are talking about is absolutely in the same point where we need. I think the most important thing is coordination between the institutions of humanitarian and development, which exists actually. We usually see, I mean, international community calls upon the development institution when there is a crisis somewhere else. So I think the role is interlinked. And what we need to do exactly, what we are looking for also at the Saudi Fund for Development, is this link between the two jobs. I think for the humanitarian nexus, I think our experience shows that humanitarian aid can deliver optimal and sustained returns if it incorporates development components. So it's important it's not only the funding is important, and the geopolitical, as you mentioned, and political agenda plays an important role, but also the way that we design such programs and how we implement them is very important. From our experience, it shows that we cannot only respond to the humanitarian needs without planning to complete this or complement this with a development plan as well. So even that, if we need more funds, it's okay, but to make it sustainable, it's important. All of us understand that there is quick need to respond to certain, whether conflict, natural disaster, whatever. But at the end of the story is, what is it that we can all do together to make this job sustainable and deliver the objective that we have unique experience in Saudi Arabia. That's why the King Salman Center is established to connect this role. From our side, also, we do coordinate with other United agencies because we believe that education should be dedicated by specialized agency, health as well, and water sanitation. So when it comes to our role, yes, we do finance some of those, but what is missing is the coordination, and I can give you some steps, to do that. I think risk management is necessary, actually, to mitigate the devastating impact of the conflict and unexpected disasters. Also, there is a need for measures for coordination and implementation plans as well. At the same time, during, I think, the long-term crisis, donors and relief agencies need to plan set of appropriate funding levels. Funding is essential in this one, but it's not the ultimate objective of such thing. Also, I think strong local participation and local partnership programs are important to ensure both short and term long aid is implementing in the same way. So the role of the countries themselves is very important and vital, actually, to have it sustainable and to deliver the objectives. I don't want to go beyond that, but I think the discussion is going. Thanks.
Antonio, when you think about this from a migration perspective, how difficult, or at least what's the most significant challenge in your view to this? Because at the end of the day, we can say we don't want to politicize humanitarian development aid, but of course politics does play a major role, and it does make your jobs much, much more difficult. How do you reach people? I mean, it's almost like CSR. It's almost as if you think of this within the context of it's a corporation, it's better for business if things flow properly and you're making ends meet and the numbers add up. the folks working for you feel like they're doing something good for humanity, then they're much more willing to put more time into the corporation. So how do you explain it to governments that this is actually better for business than it is a detraction? Because what we've seen in Europe is that migrant flows into Europe are actually good for these economies because they're aging populations. It's in many ways, it's about the sell. How do you get it there?
Well, the IOM's approach is to have a strategy of communities stabilization. It's a micro-social process. Of course, you need the endorsement of national governments. But at the end of the day, if you do not work with the people who are impacted and affected by the crisis, you will not have a positive outcome. And that's where you need to build a mutual trust relationship with the local communities. Working with local leaders, with traditional leaders, with the local authorities, and especially focusing on the youth. Because we operate in a number of areas where the state is not present at all, where there are no social services, where there is no rule of law. Dr. Tedros spoke in the first session about the DRC and the Ebola crisis. We work very closely with the WHO in North Kivu, and the access to the populations that are infected by the Ebola virus is done through very complex negotiations with armed groups that control the territory where those populations are. And we need to get in touch with them, and we need to negotiate the access, because otherwise those people will not be helped as they need. The same can be said about a number of places in the Sahel region. And that is more serious, because what we are seeing, and that's very disturbing, is that some of those groups are starting creating a social network of support to affected populations. And that is a brief for recruitment for violent extremism. So we need to be very much present there and make sure that the authorities cooperate with the civil society, with NGOs, in creating conditions for those young people to have hope for life. And donors need to understand that. And there is a difference between some donors are more sensitive than others to this kind of projects. And I would encourage more donors to look to this perspective more in detail when it comes to the nexus. Don't forget the micro-social, micro-cultural level that is extremely important.
Jens, did you want to weigh in? Did you want to add to that? Jens? Yes.
Yeah, one point very important is the one that we need to build. We need to end conflicts, really, and we need to work for that also as humanitarians and development actors. We talk about the triple nexus, humanitarian development and peace work coming together. The solution to the problems in Idlib is not more blankets. It's an end to the bombing. It's a ceasefire. It's a talks even with pretty nasty armed groups there, but it's going to be with talks. The solution to the problems in neighboring Yemen is peace. There has to be progress in the peace talks. And I think we as humanitarians and developmental actors need to help in making, in pushing those who can push the parties to go to the negotiating table. And locally, we can ourselves be actors in mediating between communities like Sahel, where Filippo and I just were. We try to get pastoralist farmers and herdsmen to have a dialogue on dwindling grazing rights and water, access to water. We try to have Islamic teachers help us open schools that extremist groups have closed. And we succeeded recently in Mali. We opened 25 schools because we had local talks with local Islamic leaders on the value of both Quranic studies and traditional educational schools. That is an area where we need to do more.
Yeah, I just want to build on your question. You know, and contrary to the usual perception or image that humanitarians don't comment on politics, I want to make a comment on politics, actually. Because if sometimes humanitarians are told that their vision is short-term, my God, isn't politics short-term? And badly short-term. And I'm not so much talking, and I think what you were referring to is politics in the way of aid. Of course it can be. But I think where politics fail us terribly these days, even more than usual, is in addressing those causes, is the link with peace and security, is instead of making peace in Libya or Syria, is fighting each other by proxy in Syria and Libya and other places, is the syndrome of we first, my country first, and not working together that prevents, out of politics, the international community to address properly climate change and the climate emergency. And I can give you a long list. So there is a fundamental problem there, and it is very short-sighted because look at it from the perspective of Antonio and me, the result of this failure, just from our perspective, is these unmanageable flows of people that in turn cause political problems. So politics is short-sighted and gets into even worse political problems because of its inability to deal with the causes. So I would make really an appeal for that nexus also to be reinforced, building on what Jan just said. And I want to add another issue. We, of course, make this argument appealing somehow to political interest, longer-term political interest, to address these causes. In other words, if you overcome political differences, address a conflict or climate change working together, you avoid down the line worst crisis. But having said this, intervention, humanitarian work cannot be only determined by political interest. I am, the argument that David Beasley made earlier, that it is much more costly to help a Syrian or anybody from a crisis in Europe or in industrialized countries than it is to help them in their own country is absolutely true. But there are situations in which people are pushed out of their countries by discrimination, by conflict, by violence. Helping them in that particular context is an absolute humanitarian, moral, and legal imperative. And that is irrespective of any other political consideration.
When you think about this from the UNICEF perspective, Henrietta, how does this impact your strategic thinking? Because at the end of the day, governments, you're talking to them about children in particular, no one's going to say no to a little kid. But at the same point, as mentioned by the other panelists, we're talking about a long-term impact and a long-term ability to sustain development.
Well, sometimes we see that governments who are run by adults think like adults, and they forget to put children at the center of their planning process. But if you do, and if you create a budget for your country, you will then think about children who need education and health and nutrition, and they need protection, and they need good water and sanitation. And all of a sudden, the social side of life comes to life, and it becomes important. May I build on one other earlier point? So His Excellency runs a development agency, and one of the things that we see out in the world is that there is not enough mix of public and private funding in humanitarian and development settings. So we who are UN agencies do not carry any funding. So when a humanitarian crisis exists, let me take South Sudan in Juba, we begin trucking water. Water trucking can cost you $1 million a day. Then a donor, often a government, is kind enough to give us some grant funding to put in a pipe that will bring water from the Nile River to the city. but it's just one pipe because it's grant funding. What we need is some public and private partnerships where there would be maybe 5 pipes. We could have loans and guarantees, maybe a parastatal or a privately run water authority in Juba. But you have to plant those seeds immediately into your planning and your thinking. And as humanitarian entities, often we don't carry those tools and capacities. So the development agencies and the private sector, the financiers, become extremely important. So we can all be better at this if we act as a team.
When we think about this within the context of the strategic development goals, sustainability goals, I should say, what's the UN's role there in terms of making a roadmap for governmental and non-governmental organizations to do just that?
So the United Nations, I think, is very strong in talking with governments about what their strategic priorities are and helping them make a roadmap. But we really want to have host country governments own it. It's their roadmap. So you don't want to be a consultant that hands a strategy. You want it to be made by the country, for the country, and with the country's people. But planning is essential, but you've got to have in all the actors, you know, the private sector and also civil society. And you have to remember that the quality of life in a country makes a difference, politically, socially, economically.
When you think about this a bit more broadly, from a UN perspective specifically, what is the greatest challenge that you see on the horizon? I mean, obviously we have with the COVID-19, we have a black swan event. But in terms of creating this sort of collaboration between humanitarian and developmental assistance, what's the greatest challenge there? Is it the politics? Is it the governments? Is it changing demographics? Is it climate change? I mean, what's going to be holding that back?
Well, I think you mentioned some of the greatest global challenges that we're facing. I'm not sure which one is graver than the other. They all seem to be quite substantive, be it the demographic gap, global migration, conflict, unresolved conflicts, climate emergency, poverty gap. You know, the list is very long. I think what makes it particularly challenging, to use that word, is their combination, which we in the refugee migration sphere see very, very much, because people move often not because of one cause or the other, but because of a combination of causes. It is in that combination that lies the challenge of our times, and I think, and I want to repeat what I just said, the fact that we should be very global, united, cooperative in our responses precisely because of the nature of these challenges. Unfortunately, recent politics have heightened a contrary trend, have promoted a contrary trend, which is, you know, we come first, we look at our interests, this is what matters, and the response in that way becomes very fragmented. In a way, you see, COVID is an interesting challenge because everybody understands the globality of a health threat better than anything else. I think in a way, it will be easier to foster cooperation around something that everybody understands threatens each one of us, irrespective of borders, nationalities, situations, and etc. What we should do is transfer this attitude, assuming that we get there, to other challenges that are less easy to look at in this same global spirit, like climate change, like the poverty drivers of migration, like the unresolved conflict that move refugees, and so forth.
When you look at that in terms of a microcosm for what could eventually be the case globally, the Sahel is, of course, the first thing that comes to mind. Walk us through this in terms of, and feel free to weigh in, panelists, in terms of being able to translate that into a message to global governments, because without governments behind you, you can't get anything done, whether it comes to funding or politics standing in the way of the aid getting to the people that you need. How do you translate that situation, at least on the climate change perspective, and explain that to governments, the knock-on effect of doing nothing? Jens.
I'm not going to talk about only one challenge, actually, which is the climate change, because I believe there are different kinds of challenges and obstacles, but some of them that we cannot control as development institutions and United Nations agencies. But I think some of them that are controllable, and we might do a better job than what we are doing. As I told you, I'm not going to go over only the climate change itself, but I think I'll allude to it. The fact that unavoidable challenges, just like conflict or natural disaster or others, and the difficulties to provide humanitarian assistance and developmental programs is an issue, and I think that's. But the level of coordination and cooperation among the MDBs, development institution, bilaterals, United Nations agency, is the issue. In some cases that I can see, as I see it, we are competing to deliver the service rather than coordinating or cooperating this one. So if we are to complement each other, I think the programs will be more effective and more sustainable. But the fact that we as a bilateral institution, we want to do the job, United Nations agencies are eager to do the job because they have the specialty, and MDBs and development institutions, they have the same role. So I guess it's important to do something among us and to agree, who's the best implementer for such disaster, whether climate or a natural disaster or conflict or whatever. The other thing is other than the political challenge, is how to work aside with the community themselves. To get in the political process, it's hard, and people, our target should be the people. Whenever you provide the service to people, whether humanitarian development, and we can talk about how to complement each other rather than compete, is the local communities. I can tell you about our experience in west of Africa, where we are drilling more than 7,000 wells. We found it is more, because it's kind of humanitarian, because the people on rural area are lacking the water. So we are providing it as a humanitarian but sustainable. So we found it, the local communities is important to engage with them and to organize them well. And the women community is more appropriate for such program. So they do maintain those wheels and control it as well. So if you want to plan it, and with the role of government is very important as well. On the climate change, as I mentioned in the beginning, I think we are talking about something that we can all work together, but I think we have to distinguish between the mitigation and the adaptation programs. If we are talking about the development, I think adaptation is more appropriate compared to mitigation, because the cost and the means that is available to local communities with adaptation is much, much broader than the mitigation. In the first step, I think we have to work with the specialized agencies who know how to do it. That will be less costly and more efficient. We don't do it ourselves, if we are doing such thing, but we depend on the organization who has the expertise and the know-how. I think we have to agree and put some kind of plan and agreement and discussion among ourselves, who's capable of doing education, health, climate change, and others, and then how can we all support this process, rather than we all doing the same thing at the same time.
Right, divvying up the burden sharing, I suppose you could say. But in terms of the climate change specifically, I do want to get to that, because I think it's something, particularly when you have a US administration that's in denial of something that most of the rest of the world agrees on. When you think about the Sahel in particular as a microcosm of what could potentially happen, we're talking about COVID-19 and the media storm that we've seen over the last several weeks surrounding that. there isn't the same sort of panic surrounding climate change that we've seen, particularly with this virus, because as you say, people don't necessarily see how it relates to them directly in the short term. How do you get that kind of messaging across globally? And you have to do it with data.
Well, I would say that 2019, at least until the coronavirus came, it was a year of having a lot more focus on effects of climate change. The wildfires from California to Brazil to Australia concentrated attention. And I think there is an understanding that big things are happening. I mean, Amazon pledges $10 billion for this. Microsoft pledges a lot of money. So the private sector, which I completely agree with Henrietta, we need to have bigger and bolder partnerships with them, seem to understand something on climate change. So you just asked earlier, what do we do to really get both governments and corporations to understand the need, the urgency of the need for action? I think two things. Number one, we need to project that it is not hopeless. It's a lot of sort of hopelessness sense now. Sahel is hopeless. It is, and whatever we do, it would be horrific, the climate changes and so on. We need to say it's not hopeless. We can do a lot. So very concretely again in Sahel, where it's war on top of climate change, on top of bad governance, and on top of chaotic situation and a population explosion, we need to provide livelihoods now for 100 million youth, basically. Is that hopeless? It's not hopeless. We could do it, but then we need to have bolder and bigger ideas. And here I would challenge the Gulf countries and so on to really, what about pledging 10 million livelihoods in the Sahel within the next 2 years? Finding a coalition of local organizations, national organizations, international organizations to do that. Big, bold ideas which would also, in a way, transcend the seminars on Nexus to action, developmental, humanitarian, and peace builders together. There's too much now talk about security forces has to be scaled out, like in the Sahel. I don't think it's killing terrorists that will bring Sahel out of the crisis. It's really much more complex. It's security, it's development, it's humanitarian, it's local peace negotiations, all of that together in one big, bold plan.
Before we open up the conference to questions of the panelists, I just wanted to go down the line of you guys and ask you specifically to tell me what you consider a challenge that we could address in the next 2 days here in Riyadh in an effective way, whether it be coordination amongst humanitarian organizations, finding that collaborative bridge between sustainable development and humanitarian assistance. What is it that you think that with the great minds in this room you can achieve in the next couple of days, even if it's just resetting the narrative?
I think that the fact that this forum adopted this theme is in itself a very important gesture or statement. And I would suggest that perhaps one thing that could be explored further is how do we, I think maybe Jan mentioned this, how do we encourage development actors, governments, international institutions to invest where the situation is very fragile? This is a big challenge because development institutions, private sector, are not terribly inclined to take risks. And yet, if you don't take risks, if you don't do what Jan just said, if you don't invest in livelihoods in the Sahel, you won't get out of this vicious circle. So, but to do that, of course, is a development gesture that is closer to the humanitarian spirit, if you wish. So I think that if this could be a useful debate and a useful message if it came out of here. You know, earlier on there were many signatures. And one signature, the one I signed with the Saudi Fund for Development, was an important investment in building favorable conditions for refugees to return to Afghanistan. Now this may sound counterintuitive, because we always think of Afghanistan as a very fragile place that will never have peace. The fact that we signed an agreement for a substantive amount of money, multi-year, to invest in areas where people return to or might return to is precisely what I'm saying, is a gesture of confidence, is a risk-taking gesture of confidence on the part of a development actor in partnership with a humanitarian one in a country that is still fragile, but where we have perhaps the first signal, as we saw yesterday, of some progress towards peace. So this combination, this is the triple nexus in action. If it comes out of this forum as a clear message, I think it will be very useful.
Henrietta.
So I will pick up on Jan's point about livelihoods. The number one request that we get worldwide from young people is that they don't feel that they're getting a modern education. They're not learning anything that will be useful for them later. So they want a modern education, they want digital skills, they want soft skills, how to be an entrepreneur, they want some occupational skills, and they want foundational skills. And if we could do that for them, it would help the Sahel, it would help so many other places in the world. And so I'd vote for that as a big, bold. This is a region that cares about education, knows its value, and the connection with livelihoods is what we need. Right now, between the ages of 10 and 24 in the world, 24 years old, we need 10 million jobs a month. We're not creating them, so we're going to have a lot of entrepreneurs. So they're going to have to learn, and we have to give them that chance.
Yes, I totally agree. I mean, with Filippo that the emergency relief and development program as well and peace building are not mutually exclusive sequential process, but they are needed at the same time. To address your question, I mean, what we can do in the days of the forum and what are the most important discussion we can go through, I think is getting closer to each other and to understand other programs and how can we complement each other and how we can work together to achieve the humanitarian and development process and peace building process as well. It is important to understand each other and what is the advantage of each institution and how they can achieve results better than other institutions. The discussion, and I think in the workshops and the seminar can reveal to us, I mean, what we can do together to achieve the ultimate goal. Of course, all of us, we have our own funding and our supporters and programs as well. But I think this kind of dialogue and the program and these 2 days will enable us to discuss and to listen to others and to be exposed on other programs as well. It might be that we have a good program, but some other institutions, they have even better programs. So we can align ourselves with that one. Other thing is, what are the new innovative ways to address? As you know, we are moving in changing worlds. I mean, where innovation is important. So, and all institutions are working on that. And if you look at them closely, you will see a lot of innovative ways of doing it. So I think it's time now for those studies to share the innovative ways of doing or combining development and humanitarian assistance as well. The example that Filippo just gave on the programs that we are cooperating with UNHCR is very important. And we actually, that out of experience and discussing with other institutions, of course, that's building peace and programs not in the refugees places in the countries, but in their own country, their home country, is important. And that's, I think, very good example of the complementarity of humanitarian and development, because we will build those schools, health centers, bring water, sanitation, power, and it will be there to stay. It will help people to return to their homelands, but it will be sustainable, so that we have already designed a program with the UNHCR to be sustainable. If you do it in the refugees camps, they will leave, and that's the hope. One day, everybody will go home. So I think the plan that for us and UNHCR to build or to spend the money in their own country, so that we will have it sustainable. So that is a good example of complementarity between humanitarian. Of course, they need the humanitarian effort because they're still under conflict and threat. But in this story, if we build those communities, it will be a good message for the international community and the local community as well. So the peace building can be achieved. And those schools and health centers and water that was brought in, and people will defend their rights. I think this is the ultimate message.
Yeah.
Well, if I had to pick up one challenge, I think that since we are talking about triple nexus, humanitarian development and peace and security, the challenge is to overcome the silos approach, the mutual suspicion of key actors in each of the sectors, as we are trying to do in the UN system. But this concern of all of crisis approach, let's call like this, also concerns the civil society, the NGOs that need to subscribe and embrace this coordinated agile approach, and last but not least, I would even say above all, the donors. Because the funding needs also to be much more flexible, much more predictable and multi-year if we want to be serious in bringing together the triple nexus. The good old methods don't work anymore, the challenge has scaled up, and therefore the tools that we need to be absolutely different. And that is quite a challenge.
Jan.
Yeah, to be optimistic, I think we may be getting closer to this situation. I mean, we have something we call the grand bargain, which was something that Kristalina Georgieva and others sort of launched as a new, as a better way of working, humanitarian actors and donors 2-3 years back. There are now an increasing number of donors who are working according to those principles, both humanitarian and developmental. Norwegians, Swedes, UK, ECHO, EU, USA and others, they are more flexible now. There is more multi-year, there is more predictability. There are also some development banks and international financial institutions. I'd like to mention the German Development Bank, for example, have started to help us in some of the worst places on earth. And they wouldn't have 2-3 years back. I think the big shift will be when the IFIs, international financial institutions, who have big money, are able to overcome all of this web of problems and all of their own in-house lawyers who make it very difficult for us to get multi-year grants to meet needs in the field where most is at stake. I think we're getting there. I mean, the World Bank launched a fragility policy that was unfortunately, you know, the meeting was cancelled because of the damned coronavirus. Again, you see this kind of a thing that a not so deadly disease cancels a meeting where we were supposed to discuss how to work with very deadly diseases. But the policy is good, and it is hinting that the World Bank and other IFIs will come. I'm waiting for that. That's my dream. That would be a big change for our work in the field.
So really making sure that we address the most fragile areas, talking about advanced education and the importance of that and sustainability of that to create livelihoods. complementary programs. I think that's very key in terms of finding solutions, sharing, combining programs. We were talking about the triple nexus in terms of financial institutions and being able to build those bridges, and of course all of that to get away from politics. But I think my first question is over on this side of the room. Someone should have a microphone. There we go. I see hands. Could we bring microphones to these hands? Right here in the center. We're getting a microphone to you. Give us 1 second. Here we go. First question? Whoever has a microphone, go for it.
Thank you very much. It is very informative and beneficial for me to listen to this very distinguished panel speak about the subject. And I think they have touched on the very sensitive and most important issues. But I would take it to another dimension, that from my experience in the humanitarian field for more than a quarter of a century, I see that capacity building for local players is lacking. When there is a disaster in some country and anywhere, the international relief organizations will come immediately and provide services. After the disaster is gone, they are gone too. And they leave the local players as they were, if not worse. So I would just emphasize this point, and I would like to ask the very distinguished panel on how to best build the capacity of local players. Thank you very much.
I'd like to pick up on that one. Henriette.
So thank you very much. It's a really important point. I think one of the untapped resources we have are young people. They are so excited about rolling up their sleeves and helping and doing something. This is a doing generation. In Mali, as you know, there have been a number of programs about peace building. And there, what we did was we gathered about 2,000 of the young people so that they would become ambassadors in their communities. They would knock on doors and get young people of other families to come to school. And they were able to reach more than 25,000 young people in their communities just because they fanned out. They could do it for an hour after school. There is a lot of training and involvement that we could do of young people. So we're trying to think about how to move all of our programs into having a sustainability of young people that could carry on the programs after the international consultants leave. It is an excellent point, and I'm just weighing in here for young people. They really are excited about this. They want to do something. So if we could involve them, they're there.
Yes, I think it's absolutely true what you have mentioned, and that's, in the past, the humanitarian effort does not include the capacity building. I think capacity building is part of the development process, and it's essential. But I think the new model now of humanitarian assistance to complement the development is part of it, and that's what we look for. In some of our programs, I mentioned in the Sahel, drilling wells, that we train people, even it's kind of humanitarian, how to operate and how to maintain their own properties. So I guess you are absolutely right, and we have to rely on the locals, whether youth are the target or the rest of the community. And I think that's what is lacking the humanitarian system, where they provide the assistance and they leave. And they leave the rest to the development. But I think the complementarity now between them, and for the humanitarian, it can, as I mentioned, deliver optimal and sustainable return if it's incorporate development components, which we believe capacity building is development component.
We take our next question.
شكرا. بداية أود أن أتوجه بالشكر والتقدير للمركز لدعوتنا للمشاركة في هذا المحفل العظيم. دكتور محمد العسبلي، مدير التنفيذي للجنة الإسلامية الهلال الدولي. حقيقة أنا أود أن أشرككم في مقاربة تتعلق بالربط بين العمل الإنساني والتنموي، وهي مقاربة تتعلق بما تناولوه المتحدثين الأفاضل، وهو الاهتمام بالتنمية وأيضا التأهيل اللي تعرض له الدكتور صالح. المقاربة تتعلق بأن الاهتمام بالشباب في بلدان المهاجرين، وخاصة المهاجرين غير النظاميين، البلدان هذه هؤلاء الشباب يتعرضوا لمخاطر. المقاربة تتعلق بثلاث جوانب. الجانب الأول يتعلق بالتوعية بمخاطر الهجرة غير النظامية. الجانب الثاني وهو التأهيل والتدريب لهؤلاء الشباب في بلدانهم. والجانب الثالث وهو إعطائهم مشاريع. مقاربة تتعلق أن منظمة التعاون الإسلامي اهتمت بهذه القضية وأسندت هذه المهمة للجنة الإسلامية الهلال الدولي، ووضعت استراتيجية تتعلق بالتعاون بين الجمعيات الوطنية للهلال الأحمر والصليب الأحمر في بلدان المهاجرين غير النظاميين. قبل حوالي شهر كانت هناك ورشة عمل للمنسقين الوطنيين من هذه الجمعيات الوطنية، بحيث أن ينفذوا هذه الاستراتيجية في بلدانهم. توعية وتأهيل، وأيضا إعطاهم مشروعات تنموية تقوم بهؤلاء الشباب أن يكونوا على أن يبقوا في بلدانهم دون التعرض للهجرة غير النظامية. هذا فيما يتعلق بهذه المقاربة، وهي نحن مستعدين للتعاون مع جميع المنظمات التي يمكن أن تتعاون معنا ومع الجمعيات الوطنية في هذه البلدان. أشكر المتحدثين اللي تناولوا هذا الجانب، وهو التركيز على الدول التي أيضا فيها مشاكل تنموية تحتاج إلى هذا الجانب. وشكرا.
I'd like to pick that one up. Would you go?
I'm not sure this is a question. It was more maybe of a comment, but which I would, of course, support very much. Maybe let me make a couple of quick additional comments to what the speaker said. First, also to reinforce Henrietta's point on youth. I think this is, you asked a question at the beginning. How can we explain to the world why we need to work together to address these challenges? What are our entry points? That was your question. Well, I think youth is one of our entry points. I think we shouldn't be romantic about youth. I think youth is a very diverse concept, a lot of different people with different opinions. We should respect that as well. But I think in general, young people across the world understand better the fact that unless you address these problems with vision, with cooperation, we won't be able to overcome them. So they are a very important constituency for multilaterals like us. And I think that to invest in youth in general, to help them with education and other tools to live up to their own expectations, I think is a very, very worthwhile investment, perhaps the most important we can make. And they can bring us that energy, courage that maybe the older generations do not have or do not have anymore. The other, because there was some remarks on youth, the other thing is about refugees, because I think there was an issue about refugees or helping people have, or rather the point was made, we should help people make the decision, not make the decision to leave. And I think that education, livelihoods, opportunities are all important things to do for young people to help them not to decide to go away, to give them opportunities where they live. I think this is the point that was made. I just want to repeat the point I made earlier. In addition to that, there are other factors that push people to leave and become refugees. Conflict, discrimination, violations of human rights, that also needs to be addressed. That's different from giving people livelihoods and opportunities. That's a different ball game. Often the two are overlapping, but they're different, and we shouldn't forget that if you don't address those drivers of displacement, you will not address the refugee problem completely.
I think we have one question straight down the center.
Hi, my name is Yasser Tabara. I am the chairman of the American Relief Coalition for Syria. It's a coalition of 11 Syrian American organizations that have processed over or little under $500 million in humanitarian aid through Syrian American expatriates and international development agencies in Syria. Firstly, I'd like to say that what Mr. Egeland's comments in terms of the addressing the root cause cannot be overstated, especially as a Syrian and especially what's going on in Idlib right now. So putting that aside, I want to sort of build on some of the comments that Dr. Al-Khudairi mentioned, which focused on local communities. And as Syrian Americans, we've seen that the best investment in terms of creating a nexus between the humanitarian work and the development work is to focus on investing in the capacity building of the governance structures of local communities that have basically a vacuum of state institutions. And what we've done is to try to heavily invest in that as much as possible. Obviously, a lot of these investments are hostage to geopolitical, considerations and geographic shifts in terms of control. But at the end of the day, the trust in, the locals, the nationals of this particular place, who see this issue as a non-humanitarian issue necessarily, they see it as a long-term development issue, is an extremely important point to emphasize. The question is, how do we, as humanitarian actors and development actors, focus on building the capacity of these local governance bodies without having to be afraid of violating some of, or overlapping with some other political considerations? I hope my question is clear. Thank you.
Yes.
It's a good question, really, and but it's also complicated because Syria is very different from Burkina Faso, where we were. I always agree we need to build local institutions, we need to build local communities, we need to build local capacity. That we should be humbly there to serve communities, and we should serve them and put them in charge. But we shouldn't also be naive. I mean, in Barcelona, there was nothing. I mean, there was very, very scared people who had fled, and they lacked everything. And you had to build, really, who are teachers, who can do this, who are that, who were elders in their villages, and then you help them build a structure. In Syria was very sophisticated civilization. It was a very sophisticated society. It had universities. It had everything, and then it was torn down by a man-made catastrophe, and little by little extremism was building up, and dictatorship and whatnot. And then in the end, some of the groups who became in charge in some of the opposition-controlled areas then became listed organizations by the very donors who tried to help us to help the people there. And we then maneuver in a very difficult, I don't know if this is particular what you're hinting at, but my organization has really suffered a tremendously difficult balancing act there, say in Idlib. We want to help the people, and you cannot not be in contact with local authorities. And when these local authorities are listed as no-touch entities, we end up in a big mess, really. So that's we have 3 people in my organization working full-time on mitigating the sanctions and anti-terror legislation of donors and host countries, and it's getting more and more difficult to do principled humanitarian work in these areas. And maybe we can be in contact if you like, if you like to have advice on our findings and how we try to lobby authorities.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Panelists, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great conversation, and thank you to the audience as well.
Thank you, Hadley, because that was very well moderated. It was a fascinating conversation. It was great to see the audience getting involved. Now, we are going to break off because I'm sure that most of you can hear the clatter of the plates. Lunch is being served outside, but also a couple of things to note, that a room has been set aside for afternoon prayers. So if you wish to use that facility, please ask the hotel staff and they will direct you towards it. Also, for those of you who may have arranged interviews with the press, there is a media gallery. Could I also ask you as well to return to this room at 2:25? Please return to the room at 2:25 for session 2 of our forum. Thank you and enjoy your meal. Thank you.